Welcome to today's interview featuring Dr. Michael Lifshitz and Jonas Mago from McGill University. Dr. Lifshitz is assistant professor of psychiatry at McGill, where he and Jonas Mago, a doctoral researcher co-supervised by Dr. Carl Friston, explore how collective rituals influence neurocognitive flexibility. They are both interested in how certain practices like collective prayer or meditation influence our subjective experience and cognition, integrating neuroscience, phenomenology, and anthropology. We're excited to explore their insights today. Welcome, Michael and Jonas.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So, your winning project for the grant is called Practicing Plasticity: How Collective Rituals Promote Neurocognitive Flexibility. I thought maybe we could start by delving into the collective rituals part and then the neurocognitive flexibility part a bit later. So, my first question to you is, what are collective rituals and why are they important?
Well, do you mind if I start with this one, Jonas?
Go for it.
Collective rituals, so we work in the domain of contemplative science. So like the study of different ritual practices and contemplative practices. And a lot of that research has focused on people doing it by themselves or like what happens in the individual as they practice. But a lot of the time in the real world, people are doing these practices together. They're doing them collectively. Collective rituals could be like meditating together, praying together, going to church on Sunday, but it could also be things like watching a hockey game or a soccer game together. And in the anthropological and sociological literature, there's a lot of emphasis on what happens when people congregate together and practice together. And there's this idea that a kind of like almost like phenomenological electricity starts like forming between people and something starts to happen. Sometimes people talk about like collective fields that get created. And we don't really have we're working towards a scientific language for how to describe those kinds of fields. But that's basically what we mean by collective ritual.
All right. Can you talk to us maybe a bit about the examples you used for your project?
Yeah. Well, in our project, we were studying prayer, evangelical Christian prayer, and specifically the practice of speaking in tongues.
Okay.
So that was one part of our project where people are kind of they're praying, but they feel like the Holy Spirit kind of starts praying through them, and they're praying in a language that we can't really understand. And they go into a kind of trance sometimes. And usually, not always, but people are doing this in congregations, right? So they go to church and they're praying together, and there's this kind of collective field that emerges. And so we were trying to understand what happens when people speak in tongues.
Okay.
And what happens when they speak in tongues together with someone else. So to keep it simpler, because like scientifically we kind of try to move step by step, we wanted to just do it in pairs. So we had dyads. So we had people come in with a friend. And this was all really led by Jonas and our other colleague, Josh Brahinsky, who's an anthropologist and now neuroscientist in California. And so basically we were studying people praying together and the ways in which their bodies and their brains actually synchronize when they're doing these practices together, and how actually different types of prayer change the extent to which their brains synchronize.
Right.
So that's one example.
And why did you choose this? How did you come to want to study this?
Yona, I don't know if you have idea. I feel like I'm talking too much.
Go for it. There will be plenty of other things for me to speak about.
Well, it's an interesting question. On the one hand, it's probably one of the fastest growing and maybe most popular contemplative practices in the world, actually. So, we tend to think of contemplative practice and think of like meditation and mindfulness, but actually there's hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the world who are engaged in this kind of Pentecostal evangelical Christian practice. And so we were really interested partially in opening up beyond just kind of Eastern inspired or like Buddhist inspired and yogic kinds of practices towards all of these other practices that people are actually doing like a lot in. For instance, in the US, evangelical Christianity is a huge current.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that's one reason. And also it's a very powerful practice. And we're interested in the idea that you can kind of train yourself to open yourself to other presences or other forces, like whether it's the force of God or whether it's some hidden part of yourself that you want to let manifest through you. And so evangelical Christians they seem to be really good at doing that. So we were really interested in what they're actually doing in their brains and in their bodies to allow that to emerge.
Nice. Okay. And maybe, Jonas, you can tell me a bit more about how these rituals, or in this case, the prayer and the speaking in tongues, what does this do to our brain? How do we begin to understand it from a neuroscientific perspective?
Yeah, totally. I think there's something to be framed here in that while these Christian prayer practices are so common, they are still rarely studied these days. There is, I think in general, studying these contemplative practices is kind of slowly gaining popularity, but most of it is focused on kind of very secular practices, on kind of meditation practices. And it really has been Michael and Joshua Brahinsky, our collaborator, who have been kind of spearheading moving this into some of the Christian practices. There's other research groups as well, but it's a lot less than what we have for mindfulness practices.
Yeah.
And so far, we're still at the beginning of kind of understanding what the data really tells us and what we kind of find in the body and in the brain. And so far, one of the kind of leading hypotheses, and that seems to be confirmed in the initial preliminary data analysis, is that there is a certain kind of loosening of neurophysiological patterns. That's kind of a measure that's been kind of used a lot in the psychedelic literature, where you find that psychedelics lead to an increase in entropy and flexibility and neurophysiological activity, and that seems to be associated with experiences of kind of an openness towards new experiences. And the phenomenology of the two practices is similar in some ways, different in other ways. And what we find in our kind of analysis so far is that some of these entropic effects, so higher criticality, higher entropy rates, that seems to also occur in deeper states of these practices. And in particular, that these measures are higher in speaking in tongues than in ordinary prayers like the Lord's Prayer or praise prayer.
Okay, maybe digging in a bit more into this concept of entropy in the brain. Could you tell us a bit about how you study this? How does this relate to EEG, or how can we understand this a bit more?
Totally. The main idea of entropy is it's a measure that allows us to measure how rigid or flexible is the brain at any given point. And practically what we do is we have the kind of time series of all the different sensors at the brain. And in principle, we can do it on the time series of the heart rate or on breathing rates, which are all measures that we collected as well. So it's like a very multimodal approach that we have. And then you can see how predictable are these time series. So given that you measured a certain time series for some time, how much do you already know about how this pattern is going to unfold in the future? And in many cases, both the brain and heart and breath activity is quite predictable. There's a certain continuity in breathing rates and the heart rate, and same in neurophysiological activity, there's a certain continuity. And that continuity is part of what allows perception to be stable. I come a lot from a field that's called predictive processing, where the idea is perception is very heavily dominated by us having certain anticipations and expectations of what perception is going to be like. And there's a certain continuity in that makes perception stable. While that stability is helpful, it also can be a problem if it gets too rigid, or if we're not able to adapt to new environments, to new information, to new things that we encounter. And so what happens is that in these moments when entropy is high, the predictability is low. What that means is we get out of these patterns, we get out of a certain stability of perceptual modes and start in some ways perceiving with more randomness. And we can measure that by just noticing that these time series are less predictable, and that seems to correlate pretty well with phenomenologies of a sense of awe, a sense of curiosity, a sense of beginner's mind.
Okay. And before we get more into the technological part of it or the practical aspects of the methods you used, I'd like to ask maybe both of you, how does this increased flexibility correlate or relate to improved well-being, or does it? Why is this important? I think that this is a really special point, and I'd love for you guys to explain it.
Do you want to have first shot, Michael?
Why don't you maybe take the lead and then
Great.
I'll jump, because this is really your...
Great. So what we know so far is that from a therapeutic perspective, the idea of increased flexibility seems to be a pretty high predictor of people being able to break out of certain maladaptive states. And maladaptive states, the more intense term for that would be pathologies. Things like anxiety loops or depression loops. Like in many ways, we think of these more and more as being not random states, but being very strong patterns of maladaptation. And these increased patterns of criticality and flexibility seem to be a really good predictor of breaking out of these states momentarily. So there is a certain state effect of feeling kind of better and well. There also seems to be a certain correlation where these state effects seem to have a tendency for a longer trait of feeling well, having certain levels of kind of heightened metacognitive awareness that reality can be different, that you have like a certain sense of openness and awe that carries over. Although that is still, I think, at the beginnings of really understanding how do these certain states translate into longer lasting traits of well-being. There is another effect, though, that while breaking out of these maladaptive states is helpful, there's the second part, which is the reconstruction. So in these high entropic states, how do we then cultivate certain new attractors? What are the new patterns in which we guide experience into? And that is where the intersubjective and the collective dimension comes in very strongly. One way of how we think about this is that these entropic states are highly suggestible states. And then the question is, what are you suggested by? Like, what is the new kind of ways of how you relate to the world? And that's where cultural context or social context seems to play a pretty strong role in what is the community that you're in, what is the kind of norms that you pick up. And that's where it becomes really interesting to study these collective rituals in Buddhist communities, in Christian communities, in other communities, and have focus a lot more on the phenomenological interviews. How do people report their experience in these communities? And there seems to be a lot of meaning making that happens by feeling to be part of this community.
Yeah, so one thing that we find that's interesting is, for example, another study that Jonas spearheaded with the Bitbrain equipment was a study of jhana meditators, the Buddhist meditators, who are doing these very deep absorption states called jhanas. And what we see there is also a clear signal of increased entropy in the brain. So, and actually some of the phenomenology, and we recently published a paper on this led by Josh Berhinsky, some of the phenomenology between speaking in tongues and jhana meditation actually looks weirdly similar. Like there's this similar kind of spiraling where people get really relaxed, or they kind of like they they heighten a sense of arousal in their body, actually. Like they start to feel like something's buzzing in them. And then they kind of allow that to really capture their attention. And so then they relax their attention into this kind of buzzing quality in their experience. And then that creates a spiral where they just go deeper and deeper into it. And that spiraling dynamic seems to be consistent between these practices. And we also see in both of these states more entropy in the brain. So, but then the thing is, like externally, like they look like very different practices. And on the one hand, people are like speaking in tongues and moving around a lot. In the other hand, they're really quietly meditating. The goals of their practice, what they're getting out of it is really different. Totally different belief systems. So I think what this shows, which is really just following up on what Jonas was saying, is that like entropy per se, like putting your brain into a particular kind of state, is not going to explain everything you get out of the practice, right? So it's almost like if you imagine entropy as like liquefying the patterns of the brain or making it much more malleable, but then you need a container that's going to determine like what shape is that malleability going to end up in, because you can't just live your life, and it wouldn't actually be good to just be, it's not that like just being liquid is good, right? It's that sometimes you're in a shape that you want to be able to like flexibly orient yourself out of. But there's always going to be a question of balance. And there's actually, I think it's really important to point out that there's a lot of pathological or like, difficult states that humans get into that are on the other side of the spectrum, where actually they have too much entropy. There's not enough boundaries. There's not enough of a sense of like solidity of who they are and what their life means to them. And they're kind of floating in a way, like you see this in psychosis, for instance, or other kinds of like personality disorders, or with trauma, often this sense of like the boundaries of self becoming too entropic. Yeah. And so it's really more about, finding these balances. And I think the social container that you're in is going to play a huge role in actually what you get out of the practice. And so what we're really interested in is showing that, how does entropy relate to that social container? So do some social containers actually promote more entropy? And then does that increased entropy also make you more susceptible to the influence of that social container?
Yeah, understood. I think that recently there's been like a big hype over plasticity and neuroplasticity, and so a lot about psychedelics or other things that enhance neuroplasticity. And I think that it's a really important point that you guys are talking about, that just having plasticity is maybe the first step, but it's not enough to make it something positive. So thank you for explaining this. I want to get into more of the technological part of your study. Can you tell us a bit what this looked like? I think that I'm very curious. So you talked about having dyads with the 32 channel versatile EEG, and then the bio as well, the versatile bio for physiological signals. Can you tell us a bit about this?
Well, you described it pretty well.
Maybe you can tell me what were some of the good things about this system, or things that maybe didn't go so well.
Maybe I'll let Jonas take that, but just before turning it over to him, I just want to also point out, we also had like video recordings and audio recordings of the people. So we have and we have respiration recordings too. So we have this really like multimodal sense, because from the video and audio, we can also look at how their nonverbal movements might be synchronizing. So we're hoping to build up this rich multimodal intersubjective data set, all the way from like brain to speech and body movement. And so, I'll let you, because Jonas was really like on the ground leading it, like making it happen. So he has a better sense of what worked and what was more challenging.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the fun thing is it already starts before we even head to the data collection site, where we can pack the equipment into a little carry-on. And then I think what's
That is
special
true.
about this is, love that. There's the
Yes.
carry-on.
We bring it all around the world.
And
EasyJet certified.
EasyJet, yeah, and it was got. We just collect some data in Mallorca. We've been traveling to all kinds of places with equipment.
Nice.
And so what we do is we have this little carry-on, and a big part of our research is that there's always a trade-off. Do you want to have a shielded room for EEG? That's how I kind of grew up. That's how I've learned EEG recordings. And you do get very good quality if you have gel and if you have a shielded room. But then what are the people really doing in such a room? And the alternative is that people are in the environment where they really like to practice and are used to practice. May it be a meditation center or church or nature. And so what we think is more important is that the people are in the states where they can actually authentically cultivate the experiences that matter. And so the priority is really to have an equipment that allows us to go there. So we have the little suitcase, we head out to these people, and then have everything in there. And then in the space where we are, whether it's a meditation center or a church, we usually have 2 chairs. We have 2 people that sit about a meter apart from each other. And then we have the caps that's kind of semi-dry electrodes. So the sponges, we soak them in water. It takes like half an hour to set up the cap. We have the respiration belts for breath. We have little ECG electrodes at the hands and the feet for like a lead 2 configuration to measure the heartbeat. We set up the phones for video recording, and they also do the audio recording. And then in some experiments, we also have evoked potential. So we have a computer playing auditory sounds or playing stimuli on the screen. So we have some photodiodes that we connect with the screens to synchronize it all. And then finally, we connect all the devices with triggering cables so that they're synchronized, that we can really understand not only what happens in the individual people, but what happens in the collective dynamic together. And at the moment, that is 2 people, mostly as a proof of concept. Ideally, we would love to get another 50 of these devices and then measure everyone in the retreat center. And so we need to think a little bit more about what that means logistically and setting all that up. And so, but that's really kind of the direction where this research is heading in towards. And then you have people sitting there, and either we have instructions. We often use this button box when they kind of transition and move into different phenomenological states, that they can mark the transition from state to state. And often it is quite a beautiful experience where then for the next half hour or 2 hours, you have people engaging with something very intimate, a practice that is very close to their heart. And it is us sitting in the back of the room, watching a bunch of EEG squiggles kind of recorded live, and witness prayer, witness the silence of the meditation while they kind of move through their practices.
That sounds lovely, and I'm really happy that we were able to share this. I could ask you 100 more questions, but since we're a bit tight on time, I'm going to ask you both a final question, and then we can close. So, how has this research influenced you in your personal life? Is there anything that you approach differently or you think about differently since beginning this project?
Yeah, maybe I can start off with this. I think one of the big takeaways for me is the experience and confidence that pretty solid neuroscience research and very authentic practices don't need to be very separated. I think in my own personal life, I have been engaged in some of these spiritual practices myself, and they feel meaningful. And then totally separated from that, I had my academic research where I did neurophysiological measurements, work on EEG, earlier also TMS, on kind of hyperscanning work. They were somewhat of a separated. And although the topic of study was meditation, was these practices, somehow there was still a gap. And with this mobile equipment, it was that I encountered to actually bring this type of rigorous neuroscience into spaces that I used to know from my own practice. And somehow that merging, like, there's a certain feel of being at a retreat center. There's a certain feel in being in churches that are full with meaning and with a certain lived experience. And bringing these two together kind of really had an integrative effect and from between my practice and my academic work. And in many ways, this work and this equipment is with that also the foundation of my PhD and the kind of thesis that I'm now slowly writing up. Yeah.
Well, congratulations and good luck.
Thank you.
You want to tackle the question, Michael, before we...
Yeah, I mean, one thing is like when you bring EEG into a church or to a retreat center, it's also just really interesting to see how people relate to it, like to the like what that does to bring this equipment somewhere, and that people get curious and they find it like they want to see what's happening, and it kind of almost makes it feel it's exciting. It feels like you're validating something that's really meaningful to people. So that's been cool to see. And it's also been kind of amazing that because these experiments, like, they're a bit nuts, like when we were proposing this stuff, I was like, because we were just starting our lab here and Jonas joined right as we were starting the lab. And this was like actually our first equipment that we got. So we put together this proposal and then it was actually accepted and we were like, oh, wow. Okay. So now we're going to really do this kind of like, kind of dreamy. For me, it felt very like, let's see if this will actually work. And now we have this opportunity. And it's kind of amazing to see that actually a lot of our hypotheses have panned out. And, because a lot of people will be like, oh, your data is going to be so noisy. It's not well controlled. And obviously, yeah, you lose something going into the field. But I think we were able to still be like quite rigorous in the way we set up the experiments, such that we could still actually get like really, I think, quite robust, rigorous findings. And it was just so cool. And for me, like as a scientist, it makes me feel emboldened, I would say, to actually like ask the questions that I'm really excited about that seem maybe hard to ask scientifically, but like maybe it's actually possible. And so that's one. And then more personally, like on a practitioner note, like we recently started a little in-person meditation group in Montreal because a lot of us meditate, but we kind of do a lot of it online or, just like post-COVID world.
Yeah.
But we started practicing again together. And I immediately felt like, oh, wow, this kind of thing that we're studying scientifically of like a collective sensibility, like this collective field, I could just feel it immediately practicing together. It was like, this is a real thing. And I mean, I don't mean real, like, I don't know what it is, but it's a real feeling. And it felt like my practice changed, like it deepened something. And so I think the scholarly scientific exploration has made me reflect in my own practice more about the importance of actually like the people I practice with, the rhythms of practice, the embodied sharing of presence with people, and how all of those things are actually, they're not kind of like a side note. It actually like deeply fundamentally changes the way that I'm able to relax into my practice. So that's been and continues to be an exciting exploration for me.
Yeah, really, congratulations. I find it fascinating, and I'm so glad that you are able to embark on this project and study these things. I think that a lot of times the very rigid neuroscientific sort of community rejects a lot of these more exploratory studies and regarding especially about these topics. And I think more and more, the more we talk about it and the more we share, everybody begins to see the importance. A lot of the communities that live the most years, the blue zones, have a lot to do with community. And so eat well, exercise, sleep well, and find a community and find that spirituality, be it whatever it is. So go for it. And thank you for talking with me today.
Yeah, and I do want to like really thank you and everyone at Bitbrain because honestly, having this equipment, like especially at this crucial launching moment in the lab, like it's allowed so much amazing work to happen, and also having Jonas on the ground to like actually make it happen and lead it, and it's been really amazing. And I don't think we would be in this position if we didn't have this equipment. So very grateful.
Thank you. And I'm super glad.
And I think there is the equipment, and as I mentioned before we started the call, an incredible generous support from the entire Bitbrain team, where this equipment, like any other equipment, has things that are challenging, where sometimes cables wear old, sometimes caps break, sometimes certain data transfer doesn't work as expected. And the customer support that I've received and the kind of help and support from the team and the opportunities to prepare equipment has been tremendously generous and is really what allowed the equipment to kind of stay up to date and work throughout all these different experiments and all the weird and funky applications.
Yeah.
So thank you.
It's been through a lot. Those two caps have seen a lot of things.
Maybe you need some more. I'll be sure to share it with the team. Thank you.